Mary Cassatt is only one of a handful of women artists up to the beginning of the 20th century who've managed to forge strong reputations in the male-dominated saga of art history. She was an American by birth, but lived in France for 60 years and helped to develop the first great movement in modern art, Impressionism. Her background was privileged, but her interest in depicting modern life and her openness to the techniques and ideas of radical artists was immense. Mary Cassatt was born in May 1843 in Allegheny City, just across the river from Pittsburgh. Her father was a wealthy banker who became the city's mayor shortly after Mary's birth. The Cassatt family occupied two social worlds, that of the old colonial American aristocracy and the new entrepreneurial capitalist society that was emerging with the industrialized nation. And consequently, Mary was socially confident, financially comfortable and culturally aware from an early age. In 1849, the Cassatt family moved here to Philadelphia, the American city that would be most closely associated with Mary Cassatt. And over the next few years, a pattern was established that would determine the nature of the rest of her life. Because within 2 years, the family had to travel to Europe, mainly because Robert, Mary's brother, was very ill. They spent time in Paris, and then in Heidelberg and Darmstadt, where the 13-year-old boy finally died. And then the family came back to Philadelphia. And in this cultivated city, that at the time was the second largest in the United States, Mary began to discover what it was she wanted to be. Cassatt seems to have made the decision that she wanted to be an artist when she was just 15, and a year later, in 1860, she enrolled in the illustrious Pennsylvania Academy for Fine Arts, America's first art school and museum. It was only over the previous century in Europe that women had even begun to be allowed to become members of art academies, and by no means all. And in certain respects, the Pennsylvania Academy was an enlightened institution which offered its numerous female students the same education that its male ones received, drawing from casts and copying old masters, as well as working with models. Cassatt, though, was disparaging, complaining that she spent too much time drawing animals, cows, she claimed. In addition, although her basic training was adequate, women students still faced a local art world whose museums, dealers and collectors expected women to be society portraitists at best. In 1865, with the American Civil War still raging, Cassatt made the inevitable decision to come to Europe to study more seriously as an artist. And so, even though her father was very much against it, together with her mother, she set sail on what effectively was an artistic grand tour. And her first stop was here in Paris. Now, she later said that Paris was the kind of place that a woman could do serious work and be recognised for it, although it's worth reminding ourselves that an artist supposedly as radical as Renoir was soon to say that women lawyers and professors were like five-legged calves, but that women artists were merely ridiculous. Now, the place she should have come to was this, the École des Beaux-Arts, the most illustrious art school in Paris, and therefore one of the great art schools of the world. But of course, it was men only. So instead, she approached one of the newly appointed professors, a man called Jean-Léon Gérôme, and became his pupil on a one-to-one basis in his studio. But her real place of learning was just a few hundred metres down the way, over the river. Here, in the greatest museum in the world, the Louvre, Cassatt joined the ranks of eager young artists who scurried around with sketchbooks or set up their easels in order to study the phenomenal collections there. But the Louvre was just one illustrious part of the Parisian art world. The place where reputations were made or broken was the annual state-supported Salon, a showcase for contemporary art, which increasingly formed an international centre for artists, dealers and collectors. Cassatt exhibited this picture, The Mandolin Player, at the Salon in 1868. It's a touching, slightly sentimental but direct image of a peasant girl making music, and it seems to have been deemed above average by the jury, who hung it at eye line on the walls, which were otherwise filled from floor to ceiling. Fired up by her modest success, Cassatt submitted once again a year later, but was rejected and told her friends she felt humiliated. After a brief visit to Rome with her mother, the Franco-Prussian War forced Cassatt back home in 1870. After a few months back in America, of course, Cassatt wants to travel back to Europe, where things have calmed down, but her parents are very reluctant to let her go, so much so that they won't give her funding. However, she decides to find her own means of funding the trip, so she goes to Pittsburgh, where she has a meeting with the Catholic bishop there, and he commissions her
to make some copies for the cathedral in Pittsburgh of work by an Italian Mannerist master called Correggio. And these works are in the Italian city of Parma. And with this commission, that's where she goes, the beginnings of another big extensive trip around Europe. And she spends about 8 months in the city, and she makes these copies, she earns her money, and then she starts to explore the art of the Italian 17th and 18th century, which starts to inform her own paintings, of which this is perhaps the best example. Now, it's quite interesting because there's a dilemma, even in her family, about her painting. They want her to be a portrait painter. That's more respectable. She wants to paint broader, bigger pictures. And in this work, she uses a portrait format to produce an image called the Bacchante, which has classical undertones. And it's a picture of a woman who's one of the followers of Bacchus, the god of wine and frenzy and celebration. And these women make noises, they cut animals up, they party, they drink. And it's as if she's working her way through aspects of European art history, with a little nod to Caravaggio, who painted Bacchanalian subjects and began really this marked contrast of light and dark in European painting. There's also something of the experimentalist here, though, in early Cassatt, because she has this rather brutal crop on the arm, which if you look close to it, you can see it was intended. You can see where the painting ends and the canvas, or the primed canvas, begins. But what you, I think, get from this painting most strongly is not just an artist who's searching for her own style, but in a rather quiet, subtle way, she's trying to make her own noise.
Cassatt returned to Paris, renting a studio at 19 Rue de Laval, and began to move away from the European old masters towards the radical young masters of her own day. The story goes that Cassatt was wandering up the Boulevard Haussmann looking at the art in the gallery windows when her eye was caught by a series of vivid, fluid pastels. "It changed my life," she later wrote. "I saw art then as I wanted to see it." Because this was the work of Edgar Degas, one of the leading lights in the first radical movement in modern art, known as Impressionism. Impressionism had come to public prominence in 1874, when a painting by Claude Monet called Impression Sunrise had been ridiculed by French critics. Their subject matter was modern life, train stations, streets, people at play, and their techniques were experimental, trying to capture the fleeting sensations of light. Equally crucial for Cassatt was the fact that they'd been regularly rejected from the salons, so much so that they set up their own exhibitions.
Cassatt's desire to be involved in the Impressionist movement is growingly evident in this painting, called prosaically but accurately, Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. When you look at it, first of all, you're